welcome to another episode of the Food for Thought podcast. I'm your host, Erin Hallstrom. With me on the podcast is Dr. Susan Blount, Vice President of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs for Mars Incorporated. Today, we're talking about food integrity, food fraud, and adulteration, and what Dr. Blount and her team are doing to ensure consumers throughout the world have safer foods. We kick things off talking about what food integrity is and what it isn't, and what companies like Mars are doing to ensure a safe food system. We take a deeper dive into regulations across the world when it comes to the misrepresentation of food and how that plays into the global supply chain. We also address issues pertaining to consumer trust and how Mars is working with its partners for more consistent harmonization, as well as the technologies that are available to detect fraudulent foods. We cap things off talking about the Mars Global Food Safety Center, as well as whether better detection methods or more regulations are more important when it comes to food fraud. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to the Food for Thought podcast. So excited to have everyone on today. Let's open up the conversation by first talking about food integrity. Can you explain what food integrity is and perhaps what it isn't?
Yeah, thank you for having me and to be able to talk about a topic that's really, really important to us as a food manufacturer. So perhaps I can start with a bit of an anecdote. So the Food Standards Agency in the UK did some analysis some time ago now, but they actually looked at basmati rice, obviously a premium product sold in the UK for whether it was basmati rice or not. And what they found was, quite scarily, over half of the product being sold actually had been contaminated or diluted with inferior long grain rice. So that just gives you, that's just one data point, but again, quite a scary one. And so, when we think about, what food integrity is and isn't, for us, making food and having a relationship with people who buy our food it's really important that it's safe and it's really important that it's authentic. And increasingly, we're now very aware as well that actually it needs to respect the environment and be sustainable. So that's a little bit about what food integrity is to us. And it's also really the basis of our relationship with the people who buy our products. They don't probably tend to think about food integrity. It's not something we want them to worry about. But what it isn't, and when it goes wrong, is actually we start then to see food that is, it might be an economically motivated adulteration. So again, diluting a premium product with a cheaper one. We see that a lot also in spices. Or it may have religious consequences. So selling, claiming halal products which aren't halal. And then there's, I guess, the sort of the final level gets you to the situation where actually you might end up with food that isn't actually safe because of the adulteration that's taken place. So you may have, undeclared allergens, which obviously start to, they're all really, really important in terms of sort of food integrity, but obviously there are layers of consequence for the consumer. And all of this costs the food industry, about 30 billion euros a year. This is a really big issue for us to tackle.
How can a company like Mars, and perhaps the industry as a whole, ensure food integrity?
That's a great question. And Mars has a big global footprint of raw materials. So we buy, over 8 million tons of raw materials from many geographies to go into our vast product range. So we have an opportunity as an individual company and also with our peer companies and, as the whole industry to help shape both the regulatory environment in which we operate, to have the lens of what's actually going on in the food industry and what we're seeing in terms of our specifications, our supplier quality assurance programs that we have in place to make sure that, our suppliers are giving us what we're asking for, for the country in which we're making product, and really sort of working together in this sort of food safety space, which we consider pre-competitive, to share knowledge and work together, both to sort of identify the risks that we see and also the solutions that we're all working on to raise the bar for everybody. And it's really important to do that because we now live in a world with very complicated global supply chains. We're moving lots of raw materials and products over many geographies and jurisdictions, which gives consumers great choice. But we want to keep advancing the sort of supply chain integrity so that we really can, continue to invest for a better world for everyone tomorrow.
Let's talk a little bit about food fraud and adulteration. Regulations vary across the world regarding misrepresentation of food. You brought one up a little earlier. It seems like that might have an impact on the global supply chain. And again, you just talked about that a little bit. Are you seeing that right now at Mars? And then a really quick follow-up to that question. Are there ways we can ensure or work toward guaranteeing more consistency when it comes to regulating how food is represented or, I guess, rather misrepresented?
Yes. When it comes to different regulations in different geographies, absolutely, it impacts the supply chain. And it's important that, again, as a food manufacturer, we understand the different regulations, the different environment, and what that actually means for those countries. So food integrity, isn't really regulated per se, but what we see is some regulators setting criteria for authenticity of their products, what is and isn't allowed, in a raw material in terms of preservation and sort of farming techniques. So there are regulations and regulatory controls in place. And, one of the things that, one of the tools that we can have is to try and drive harmonization of those regulations. Again, we talked about raising the bar. So, if we can remove some of the differences in regulatory controls, then it enables, a more of a level playing field and a safe supply chain for everybody. One of the other tools that we have, to tackle food fraud, obviously, is the other end of the spectrum, which is then the sort of the testing methodologies. So, what testing we can do to see whether, products are authentic, and actually to allow us to move products safely around the world. So we need, regulation on its own can't do the job, but it is important because every time we have an issue, we erode trust with our consumers. We erode trust in food. So it is, that's really the power of working together to drive those tools. So when we talk about, sort of moving to a more sort of consistent harmonization, there are a number of external partners that we as Mars and many other partners work with. So Codex, who work to drive safe regulations globally, and also to facilitate trade. And then the AOAC have a part to play. They look after sort of global methodology, and so they establish standards for food safety and the methods by which we can demonstrate and all use them. So if we can get globally recognized best practices on how we sample, how we analyze products, and the reference databases we use, that really starts to unlock the war on people who commit fraud and help us maintain standards of identity. And it's not without challenge, because there are incidents where, as we start to collect data and put it into databases, it is important that we understand what we're collecting. There was an example where Tesco were required to withdraw what was perceived as some fraudulent honey because it didn't match the reference sample in the database. And actually, what transpired was it didn't match that particular sample in the database, but actually it wasn't a fraudulent sample, and actually the comparison, the database comparison, just wasn't sufficiently extensive. So, it's a learning process, it's an iterative process, and the more we can work together to elevate that, sort of integrity in the data, then again, it's much more powerful than any one actor working by themselves.
Can you tell me more about how food fraud is detected? What kind of technology exists to detect this sort of thing?
Yes, so when it comes to trying to detect food fraud, it's really making sure we have the right techniques for the right occasion. So at the sort of farm level and relatively crude techniques, you can use spectroscopy, which basically means taking an analysis of your sample and seeing if it matches what you expect to see. And that, is a relatively cheap analytical method, and as I said, can be applied to sort of handheld devices now, so that people in the field can do those tests, on the ground. And that gives you a blunt instrument, really. It sort of tells you may have a problem, you may have something that's different. It doesn't really tell you any more than that, but it gives you that weak signal. And then what you then can do is actually go to more advanced analytical techniques. At the Mars Global Food Safety Centre, which we invested in about, not quite a decade ago, to conduct research into food safety, one of the priority research areas we have there is food fraud. And we are working with more sophisticated spectrometry fingerprinting techniques. So in the same way we have fingerprints that are unique to us, it's possible to look at, again, if we think about rice, such an important commodity, there are fingerprinting techniques that we've developed in conjunction with Adulteration Technologies and Queen's University Belfast to look at fingerprinting techniques for rice, and it can get down to a level that can tell you, if you're claiming your rice is from the Guangzhou region, it can tell you whether it is or actually whether it came from another region such as Chengdu. So that technique really can get much more sophisticated and give you a lot of trust in whether you've got the rice that you think you've got. And again, that then means you can sort of sell that to the consumer and have a really good relationship, because you have absolute trust that what you say your product is, it actually is what it is.
When it comes to detecting food fraud, which do you feel is more important, developing better detection methods or developing more regulations? And can you speak to the pros and cons of each?
I think that's a great question, and it's a big challenge. And I work in regulatory affairs, as I said. So for me, having regulation, it's really, really important, because the regulation sets a tone, it sets a culture by which everything else is built on, and it sets that framework, that really sets you up for success. So it's really important that we have, a very robust regulatory framework with which to manage, the vast challenges we have within our supply chain. But on its own, it can't do everything. So it can be very challenging for regulators to just keep up with the sheer number of, products that are moving around the world in real time. And we also need to continue to provide regulators with, evidence, to be able to conduct their enforcement, to give them the tools to be able to potentially drive to prosecution. So, what's also important is that we have the analysis that goes with that. So I think the better the methods we have, the quicker we can get that initial weak signal, and the more advanced we can get in terms of being able to detect what's going on. They're both really, really important, and one without the other doesn't really work. So, as I say, they're both really important for the food industry. And again, Mars we are conducting, exploring ways of, looking at new authentication protocols. We're looking at new tools like artificial intelligence to help us identify trends and weak signals. And then, as I said before, working in partnership with NGOs and academics to share that information. So, they're both really important, and they both do an important job.
Are you able to speak on any new initiatives Mars is working on as it relates to food integrity, food fraud, and adulteration?
Yes, let me give you a little bit of a perspective of what we're doing. And this is really, what gets me out of bed in the morning. This is why I do my job and why I love working with people at the Global Food Safety Centre and working with collaborators, because I think we have an opportunity together to really drive this forward. So we have a couple of things that we're really focusing on. One is, the future of digital. So how do we take data and digital solutions and really, unlock some of the challenges that we have in remote parts of the world? And, just as we said before, data is our friend if we use it wisely. So starting to look at how to share information, how to, sort of build robust databases so that we can all benefit from, the huge amounts of data that everybody is collecting. So that's one focus area. And then I think the other thing that's really, really important is horizon scanning. So the ability to look beyond today. We talked about the importance of regulation, and, we have enforcement in the moment, but we need to start to anticipate what's coming. So we're also very invested in technology to look at how we scan the horizon for, both sort of the science and the regulation, and increasingly, the consumer perception of science, so that we can start to think about what are the things that are coming, on the horizon that will be relevant to us and the products we make. And of course, the challenges of climate change, they are really putting stresses and strains on the global supply chain and the raw materials. And so as we see fluctuations in supply and price, being able to monitor, the impact of what might happen and what that might drive is really important. So they're just a couple of things that, we're working on and sharing with others to really try and sort of proactively anticipate what are some of the things that may be coming that will also affect us, so we can get ahead of that curve and tackle some of that, that big number we talked about at the beginning of this call. This really is a big industry in terms of fraud. And if we can tackle it more proactively, we can really start to move the needle and make some big successes, which means that we can then, really shore up the trust that our consumers have in the food industry and the products, we know and love, and we love to make for all our consumers.
Well, Susan, you provided so much information. I want to thank you. This was an absolutely fantastic and informative episode, and so excited to have had you on today. And I just want to say thank you for joining me today on the Food for Thought podcast.
It was my pleasure.
For everyone listening to the Food for Thought podcast today, thank you for tuning in. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, in just about everywhere you can listen to a podcast. Be sure to tune in next time as we talk more about the stories behind the headlines of the food and beverage industry. Take care. Have a great day.